You may be seated. There are some sermons, when I write them, I have specific people or issues in mind as I work on them, and then sometimes I write sermons where the Holy Spirit is speaking to me. And hopefully you'll get something out of it because I already have. And this is one of those sermons where I felt the Spirit was speaking more to me than maybe that He's going to speak to any of you. And it's not very often that I have dreams where I know that God is speaking to me, but one of those happened again last night. And what was coming to mind was some of the things that I was working on with this sermon. And God was just convicting me and saying that this is you. This is what you need to hear. So I'm hoping that some of you will overhear a message that I'm going to preach to myself. Jacob was a wrestler. He wrestled with his brother Esau in the womb. He wrestled with his brother for the birthright and for being the privileged person in the family. He watched his wives wrestle over children, trying to earn his affection. And then finally, he wrestles with God. Our scripture reading is found in Genesis 32. That night, Jacob got up and he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And after he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overcome him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man answered him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and you have overcome." And Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel. He was limping because of his hip. And therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Jacob was a wrestler. And he is going to wrestle with God. Now, wrestling is an extremely accurate metaphor to describe what happened to Jacob and also to describe what happens to us. In ancient wrestling, it's not like how kids wrestle today, where you try to pin the person on their back on the mat. Ancient wrestling was probably closer to judo or modern-day mixed martial arts, if you've watched any of the MMA stuff on television. There were only 3 things that were prohibited. You couldn't gouge the eyes, you couldn't break their fingers, and you couldn't grab their genitals. But anything else went. You could put them in submission holds. You could choke them out, or you could put incredible stress upon their joints so that they would tap out because of either fear or pain. There was no time limit. And so the way you scored points was to pick your opponent up and to throw them to the ground on their back. In fact, the word wrestling literally means to get dirt on your back. And that was how you scored a point. And so 3 points would win the match. Well, we wrestle, don't we? We feel like we're grappling with things and that we're being tossed around and that we have submission holds put on us. And so some of the things that we grapple with is we grapple with our past. We wrestle with decisions that we have to make. We wrestle and grapple with guilt, with relationships, with opportunities, with choices. We also wrestle with God, don't we? How many of you have wrestled with God? You're liars. All of you have. Every one of us has wrestled with God at some time or another. Well, in order to look at this episode, and it's actually chapters 32 and 33, we're going to look at this using modern wrestling techniques. We're going to have 3 periods, which is what amateur wrestlers do. They have 3 periods that they wrestle. And so the first period is found in Genesis 32, verses 1 through 21. And if you'd want to follow along, that would be great if you would do that. But what happens here is that Jacob's wrestling is actually like a tag team, in that he has multiple opponents. And in this first period, Jacob's opponent is his past relationship with Esau. You see, Jacob, he's been with Laban for the last 20 years. The reason he was with Laban is because he had cheated his brother, he had deceived his father, and so he had to get out of town. And so he ran to Uncle Laban. He had left the promised land. Now God has called him back to the promised land. And Jacob's between a rock and a hard place. He can't go back to Laban, and he's frightened to come and to see Esau because he doesn't know if Esau still ticked at him for having cheated him out of the birthright. And so he's wrestling with his past. Well, the amazing thing that happens here, and oftentimes we overlook these first 2 verses, is that Jacob, as he is getting ready to cross the Jabbok and to come into the across the Jordan River and to come into Canaan, he sees a camp of angels. Now, the last time Jacob saw angels, you remember? It's when he was leaving Canaan. And he was running away, and he thought that he had been disqualified from the promise and the covenant, and he falls asleep, and he has this dream where he sees Jacob's ladder, where he sees angels ascending and descending, and God makes his incredible promise and says that I'm going to be with you. And I'm going to be with you when you're out of Canaan, when you're in Haran. And I'm going to bring you back to this place, and I'm not going to leave you until I'm finished with my plan for you. That was great encouragement for Jacob. And so now he's coming back, he's frightened, and he has a vision of angels again. And I'm sure that Jacob thought, this is great, and that I have God's assurance again. God is with me. And so he feels really good about that, and so he names the place 2 camps, either because there were so many angels that it took 2 camps for them, or because there was the angel camp in his camp. And then we get a play off of the words. And that the same word for angel is the word for messenger. And so what Jacob does is he sends his angels, his messengers, to Esau. And I think it's because he's emboldened. And so he sends these messengers to Esau, and he's got 3 things that he wants Esau to know. He wants Esau to first know that he's coming. He doesn't want to surprise Esau. And then these messengers are supposed to tell Esau that why Jacob has been gone for the last 20 years and what he's been doing, and that he has prospered. And so he's trying to alleviate any fears that Esau has that Jacob's coming back to cheat him again. You know, he's not looking to cash in on having the family blessing. And then third, he wants Esau to know that he is wealthy enough that he can pay back what he had stolen from Esau, that he can pay him back. Well, Jacob is probably hoping that he's going to get a positive response. Well, his angels, messengers, come back. And they tell him, Esau's coming with 400 soldiers. Good news, bad news. And so Jacob, when he hears this, he becomes extremely frightened. And so then what he does is he takes his company. Jacob has so much stuff now. He's got camels and donkeys and cows and servants, and he's got 4 wives and 12 kids, 11 boys and 1 daughter. The daughter probably had to have her own car, full of stuff, bringing all of her things. And so he's got all of this stuff, and he's got so much of it that he divides it into 2 camps, playing off of that same word again that we just had, because he thinks that if Esau comes and destroys one camp, maybe the second camp can escape. Well, Jacob is wrestling. Can you see that? He's wrestling with his past. He's wrestling with Esau. He's wrestling whether I want to run away or not. And the way I see it is that he's doing this wrestling, and it's like that ancient wrestling where you're trying to get a hold on somebody and you're trying to throw them, and all of a sudden Jacob feels like he's going to be thrown, that he's going to lose the point. because the temptation is to run away. He ran away before to go to Haran. He ran away from Laban. And so now what's he going to do? He wants to run away. And so he's planning on how he could do that. And so he's dividing all of his things into two different camps. And yet that isn't what he wants to do. He doesn't want to run away. And so he's wrestling, he's struggling with this. And all of a sudden now Jacob goes for a counter move. And what Jacob does is he prays. He tries a new tactic. Now, we only have 2 prayers of Jacob listed. You remember what the first prayer was? That was after, the Jacob's ladder scene. And what Jacob prayed after having that incredible encounter with God is that Jacob has this very conditional prayer. He says, okay, God, if you're going to bless me, if you're going to bring me back, if you're going to give me food, if you're going to give me clothing, then I'll believe in you. Then I'll come back to this place at Bethel. Then I'll worship you, and you'll be my God. Well, this time Jacob doesn't pray a prayer of conditions. After 20 years of living with Uncle Laban, he finally gets it. And instead, he has this incredible prayer, this heartwarming prayer, where he confesses to God, and he says that when I crossed the Jordan River the last time, I had nothing but a staff because I was running away. I had disgraced myself and my family, and I didn't deserve anything, and yet now look at me. I'm coming back across the Jordan River, and I have so much stuff, I have to divide it into 2 camps. You have blessed me. But he says, and he goes on, he says, I'm afraid. I am afraid of my brother Esau. And the reason he's afraid is because he's cheated Esau. He says, I'm afraid. And so I ask for your deliverance, that you would deliver me. No conditions attached. That you would simply deliver me so that you would fulfill the promise, the covenant that you have made. Jacob makes this incredible, heartfelt prayer, asking for God's help and God's deliverance. He addresses God 3 ways. He calls him the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God who made a promise to me. Well, Jacob's still wrestling, though. He's still, trying to figure out what he's going to do. And so he's countered the move of his past, which tried to throw him to get him to run away. And so now Jacob goes for his own move. And the move that he is making is he wants to make restitution. And so what he does is he takes this exorbitant gift, and you can read that, about how many cows and camels and donkeys and sheep that he is going to give to his brother Esau. And he puts them in 3 different groups. And they're on the road that Esau is coming. And they're stopped at strategic places on the road. And so as Esau is coming with his 400 men, this gift that Jacob is giving to them, this is what the messengers are supposed to say. These belong to your servant, Jacob. You catch that? It's no longer, I'm not the one with the birthright. I'm your servant. This is from your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my Lord. He takes a subservient role to my Lord Esau. And moreover, Jacob is behind us. Jacob is behind us. And so what Jacob is doing here is he is trying to change Esau's heart. He's trying to soften him up because of his guilt. Jacob was afraid to see Esau. Now he wants to have Esau look kindly upon him. And so he sends this gift. He's no longer running. That's why he says, and Jacob is behind us. He's not hiding behind sheepskin anymore. He's not deceiving anybody. You know exactly where he is. He's right behind us. You know where he's going to be. And there is a play throughout this whole 2 chapters on the word face. So we'll keep that in mind because Jacob didn't want to see the face of Esau, and now he wants to soften up the face of Esau so that he will look kindly upon Jacob's face. Well, implications from period number 1. Jacob's down a point. he's struggling. He got tossed one time. But the first thing that I see is that God is with Jacob. That was the point of the visitation of the angels again, is it reminds Jacob that God is with him. And we need to be reminded that God is with us, don't we? God is with us. Even when we're in the Hard Rock Hotel, remember last week? God is with us. He's traveling with us. He cares for us, and he loves us. So that's the first thing that I see. But the second thing that I see is Jacob's prayer. And there are two things about Jacob's prayer. One is it's really, really good, but the second thing is when he prays it. And that Jacob's prayer, he doesn't do it as a first response. It was as a last resort. You notice that he divided his company first? He divided his company. He was thinking, okay, if Esau destroys one company, maybe half of us can get away. He wasn't going to run away, but maybe. He was looking for a human solution to this problem that he had with Esau. And so he prays, secondly, as a prayer of last resort. And so that's one of the messages that God's been speaking to me is, do I pray as a prayer of last resort instead of as a first response? And so many of us, we do. We pray when we're in trouble and not when things are going well. In fact, the only time we really turn to God is when we got a problem on our hands. And then when we do have a problem, our prayers are prayers of complaint or prayers of deliverance. Why is this happening to me? And we never ask, why not me? But why is it happening to me? Why did I get cancer? Why do I have ALS? Why did my kid die? Why did we get a divorce? Why are we having financial suffering? And it's a prayer of last resort. And then we say, well, God, rescue me. God, help me. And what we need to realize is that we are so, so blessed. So blessed. Even when we are suffering, we are blessed. 2/3 of the world doesn't have clean water, doesn't have access to medicine, doesn't have access to doctors. Do we ever ask, why not me? Why am I in the 1/3 and not the 2/3? 2/3 of the world now has to worry about terrorism and bombings and violence. Do we ever ask, well, why not me? We don't have to worry about that stuff. We're in the 1/3. Are we grateful for that? And even when we do suffer, when we do get cancer, when we have ALS, when we have a child die, when we have bad things happen to us, are we grateful for the fact that we have medicine for treatment, that we have ways to make it so that we don't have to be afraid of the pain of that? And are we grateful for the fact that we have Jesus in our life, that we're going to have everlasting life? That even if you get a physical healing, you're still going to die. We're all going to die. That's just the human condition. That's what happens to us. But are we grateful that because of our relationship with God that we can live forever? And that the grave isn't the end. It's just a doorway to an experience with God. That we're going to see our loved ones who have already passed away. Do we remember that? Are we grateful for that? Or do we just pray as a last resort? Why me? Third, our sins will find us out. Jacob was afraid to see Esau because he was guilty. And so because of that, Jacob thought that bad things were going to happen to him. And so when he heard that Esau was coming with 400 people, he immediately thinks, well, Esau's coming to kill me. There's also the possibility that Esau was coming to escort him into the promised land, that there was no threat intended whatsoever. But have you ever noticed that when you're guilty about something, you always think that something bad's going to happen to you? That when the phone rings, you think it's going to be bad news, that somebody's going to cheat you or something, or is going to chew you out or whatever it is? That we always have a negative concept when we're sinning. And there's a good reason for that. It's because we're guilty. And we feel guilty about it. And so it makes us have a pessimistic viewpoint. But you and I, we should be the most optimistic people in the world. because we have the greatest news of all. We can be forgiven, and we can forgive others, and we have everlasting life. There were two little boys. One little boy was like us. He was always a pessimist. Nothing was ever good enough. And so they put him in a room one time with a whole bunch of brand new toys, and he griped and complained. There weren't enough of them. There weren't the right ones. He didn't have anybody to play with. He was upset. The other little boy, he was a consummate optimist. And they put him out in a field with just had piles and piles of manure. And he was laughing and giggling, and he was digging through that manure, and they heard him saying, with all this manure, there's got to be a pony in here someplace. What are we? Do we gripe and complain in the incredible excess of luxury that we have, or can we dig through the manure laughing and giggling because we know there's a pony in here someplace? We should be the optimists, the most positive people around. And then the last implication that I see is we need to stop running. Jacob was stopping. He isn't going to run anymore. I'm right behind this gift. Esau knows exactly where I am going to be. I'm no longer going to run away. Got no place to run, but I'm not going to run away anymore. I'm going to head face to face what I need to deal with. Wrestling is a sport where you cannot run. You have to embrace your encounter. And so Jacob is going to wrestle and not run. Round 2, second period. This is found in chapter 32 again, verses 22 through 32. This is the actual combat between Jacob and this unknown assailant. Now, when you read this in the Hebrew, it's all pronouns. He wrestled. He cries out. He dislocates the hip. And you're not told in the Hebrew whose hip was dislocated, who was doing the dislocating, who was crying out. So when we read this in the English, it ruins it for us because it gives the antecedent to the pronoun, and it tells us about Jacob and about this other man. Whereas in the Hebrew, we're not told that until the very last line. And so there's a great deal of suspense as you're wondering about this wrestling thing that is going on. And there is a play off of the word wrestle. The word wrestle rhymes with and sounds like Jacob and Jabbok. And so you've got, this word play, this rhyme as to what is going on. And so they start to wrestle. And the description of this wrestling match is just incredible. We're not sure who is winning. And so picture it. Jacob's wrestling. He's put his family on the other side of the Jabbok. He stays. This guy shows up, starts to wrestle with him. They're wrestling all night. We don't know who's winning. It's that ancient style of wrestling where you're trying to get a hold on somebody and you're trying to flip them and throw them. Neither of them seems to be able to gain an advantage. And then finally, the person who's Jacob is wrestling, he puts a hold on him where he dislocates his hip. And what the guy who's wrestling Jacob would expect is that Jacob would tap out, that he would give up, he would surrender and say, that's it, I quit. But he doesn't. Jacob swings around and he puts a clinch hold on him and he won't let go. Jacob has no chance to win now. He's dislocated. He can't move. There's nothing he can do, but he refuses to tap out. And he wraps his arms around this guy and he says, I'm not going to let go. I'm not going to let go. And so then finally this angel says, let me go, because it's daylight. He doesn't want to be identified. And so Jacob realizes it's not a man that he's wrestling, that who he is wrestling is an angel. But here's the part that speaks to me, is that when he's wrestling with him, all of a sudden, again, this is, using that wrestling image here, is that the angel picks Jacob up. Jacob's not winning. Never was winning. The angel picks him up, and he's ready to throw him to the ground and defeat him. And the way he's doing that is he says, "Who are you? What's your name?" And when the angel asks Jacob what his name is, he isn't asking him what his name is. He knows what his name is. What he's asking is, "Who are you? What is your character? What's in your heart?" And this is what the dream was last night for me. And this is where this message has been speaking to me all week long, is who are you? And can you imagine how Jacob has to answer this? He's up in the air. He's about ready to be thrown down. He's about ready to lose the match. And he has to say, "I'm a liar. That's who I am. I'm a schemer. I'm a deceiver. I'm a cheater. I've cheated my brother. I've cheated my father. I've made my wives play off of each other. I'm a louse. I'm a crook. I'm terrible. That's who I am." Jacob's character is just as dislocated as his hip. Can you identify with that if we actually are serious about ourselves? Ask yourself, who are you? And don't tell me your name. Who are you? I'm a sinner. I lie, I cheat, I steal, I look for my own advantage. And I deceive people because I make myself look a whole lot better than I really am. Who am I? And that angel could pin him. I mean, this would be it. But he doesn't. The angel puts him back down on the ground. He says, "No longer are you Jacob. You are Israel." There aren't very many born-again stories in the Old Testament. There aren't very many conversion stories. But this one is. Jacob goes from being dislocated character to being made Israel. One who has striven with man, with his past, with his conscience, with his brothers, with his wives, with God, and has now prevailed. Jacob didn't defeat the angel. He defeated himself. And he became a new person, a new creature. The period ends with the score tied. Because the angel could have won, but he didn't. And so Jacob then asks for the angel's name, and the angel doesn't give it to him. Because it's not about the angel. It's about Jacob. So he doesn't tell him who he is. And so then the angel just disappears, and we're not told how he disappears, but all of a sudden he's just gone. Jacob finds himself on the other side of the Jabbok River, and he names this place Peniel, which equals face, that play off of the word face, because I have seen the face of God. Well, implications. First implication is that Jacob's struggle was not a dream. It was real. The writer of this story wants us to know that this was not a dream sequence like the Jacob's ladder was, that this was an actual physical conflict that Jacob had with God. Because this angel is not just an angel, it's the angel of the Lord. The implication for us is that you and I probably will not have a physical wrestling match with God. But our wrestling matches with God nonetheless are real. They are significant, and they can be life-changing for us. Second, and again, it's playing off of this word face, is that Jacob's real opponent was himself. And so here's what I see happening. Jacob was afraid of facing Esau because he was afraid of facing himself. Ever felt like that? Because he was afraid of facing himself. When he faced the angel of the Lord, he was forced to face himself. Who are you? He faces who he is. When we're afraid to face something, what that usually means is we're afraid to face ourselves. You're afraid to face somebody. It's usually because you're afraid to face yourself. In the Old Testament, in the Psalms and Proverbs, there are several verses where the scriptures are described as being like a mirror. When we look into them, we see ourselves. Paul speaks about Jesus as being like a mirror, and that when we look into Jesus, we see ourselves. And that's what's happening to Jacob, is that when he was wrestling, he saw himself. And he said, in seeing himself, I saw the face of God. And now that I've seen the face of God, I'm ready to face my brother, Esau. Thirdly, Jacob's new name, that conversion story. Jacob didn't win the wrestling match. He defeated himself, and so we have this born-again conversion story. But Jacob walks away with a limp. And we too, when we wrestle with God, when we wrestle with ourselves, when we really do that hard work of confession, is who we are. Well, third period ends, or the second period ends, and so we start the third period. And this is chapter 33. And it continues this wordplay of face and the wordplay of crossover. Jacob crosses over the Jabbok. His family crosses over the Jabbok. And now we find that Jacob crosses over in front of his family to face Esau. Before, he had been using his family as a human shield. He sent all of them ahead of him. He doesn't do that now after his wrestling match. He crosses over in front of his family, and he is going to confront Esau. And when he confronts Esau, all of a sudden we find that Esau embraces Jacob. Now, picture the scene. When you wrestle somebody, you got your arms wrapped around them. An embrace of conflict becomes an embrace of reconciliation. You see that? They got their arms wrapped around each other, but not to throw the other, to defeat the other, but to be reconciled. So they weep. They weep over all the horrible things that had happened to them. Jacob bows down to Esau, says he's sorry. Esau embraces him and welcomes him. And so these two boys, they weep. They weep over their past. They weep over their hurt, their overjoy. They weep over their joy of forgiveness. And then Jacob pleads with Esau to accept the gift. Now, the reason why this is so important to him is because if Esau accepts the gift, then it means that he's been forgiven. And Esau, according to Eastern tradition, rejects it. That's just what you do. If somebody offers you a gift, you say, no, I've got enough. And then Jacob, according to Eastern tradition, says, no, I insist. And then Esau accepts it. And so these two boys who had been wrestling in the womb, wrestling in their whole entire lives, are no longer wrestling with each other. So the wrestling match has ended. And then Jacob describes it by saying to his brother Esau, to see your face is to see the face of God. To see your face is to see the face of God. So here's that whole thing on face again. Jacob was afraid to see Esau's face due to his sin. He sent gifts to soften Esau's face so that Esau would see Jacob kindly. Jacob saw God's face while wrestling. He saw his own face. He had his face changed from Jacob to Israel. He is now able to see the face of Esau, and in receiving forgiveness, he now sees in Esau's face the face of God. That's the story of Jacob and Esau. The implications that I see from this third period is that the role of confession and forgiveness. The healing of Jacob's family, of Abraham's family, begins now. because of this confession and because of this forgiveness that it's happening. The implication for us is that when we forgive each other, when we make confession to one another, it lets us see God, and it lets others see God in us. This is what brings about healing in our families, is when we forgive rather than holding grudges. Final implications. The first one, it is okay for you to wrestle with God. It is okay. Don't feel guilty if you're wrestling with something. Self-examination questions now. With what or with who are you wrestling? With what and with who are you wrestling? Whose face are you afraid to see? Is it your own? Is it someone else's? Are you hanging on for dear life? Because we can. We don't have to tap out. We can hang on. We can ask for a blessing. We can confess and forgive. We can be changed. You need to come this morning and wrestle at the altar. You have the opportunity to do that. You can wrestle in your chair or at your table. You can wrestle anywhere. In fact, those of you who have had kids, your kids wrestled everywhere, didn't you? And then you yelled at them, quit wrestling in the house. Go outside and do that or whatever. You can wrestle anywhere. And if you need to wrestle and have that conversion experience of being changed, I'd invite you to do that. Let's pray. Father, you ask us, who are you? I'm broken. It's not just my hip that's dislocated. It's my character, my spirit, my soul. But you can heal